So far, we are already inserting and reading from a local database that we have in SQLite. The next natural step is for us to start listing what we have already read from the database into a list. But before taking a look at how we can list elements inside of Xamarin Forms, we have to talk about something that is going to be very handy when we try to do that. And that is data binding. Data binding is going to allow us to create a direct connection between objects. And what this is going to help us do is connect a source object to a target object. Let me explain what I mean by that. The basics of data binding is that we're going to be able to have a source object and bind it directly to, for example, a UI control. And this UI control can be any UI control that you can think of that we can start displaying into the UI, for example, inside of a list. The basic relationship is going to be between a property from the source and a property from the target. And where this is going to be very useful is when we have a list of objects, each of which has, for example, a text property, and we want to bind it to the text property of, say, a label. This is where it becomes very important, because we can have a source object that is directly connected to a target object, and these properties are going to be in sync at the beginning. And there are two steps that we need to follow in order to establish data binding in our application. The first step is to set the binding context. And the binding context is basically going to be the source object. We're going to be setting the context for the binding to the source object from where we want to get all the data. And then this context can be as general as we want or as particular as we want. For example, we could set a binding context to an entire grid. This context would apply to all of the children of the grid, as well as the grid itself, of course. So if we wanted to set the same object to be the data context of an entire application, we could set the context to, for example, the content page. And then this context will be applied to all of the elements defined inside of the content page that we have been using. But then, of course, we can also set the binding context to be, for example, only for one label or only for one entry, if that is what we're looking for. The second step is to set the actual binding. And to set the actual binding, we're going to need two things. We're going to, of course, be binding to a source that we mentioned at the beginning. We're going to have the source and we're going to set the target. In the target, especially in XAML, we're going to be setting the source through the path. The path is going to be pointing to one of the properties that is inside of the binding context. So in this case, the binding context will be an entire object, and the path, the source, will be pointing to one of the properties of that object. And then we can optionally set the mode. By default, the mode is set to one way. One way means that the target is going to be obtaining the value from the source. So it's just a one-way connection from the source to the target. And this is the default setting. But if we wanted to, we can change it to two-way. So both the target is going to set the value for the source, but also the source can set the value for the target. And this is especially useful, for example, in entries, where maybe at the beginning there is some value coming from the source, but then when the value changes inside of the entry, that value goes back to the source. And then we could also set it to one way to source, which would be the opposite of one way. The value would be set from the target to the source. This is just a very basic explanation of what data binding is and how it's going to help us create a connection between objects. And the reason why we're touching data binding now is because we're going to be using it in a very simple way when creating the list views. We're going to be doing a lot more with data binding in the MVVM section of this course, but now that you have a basic idea of what data binding is, in the next lecture, we're going to start displaying what we have read from the local database into a list, using a little bit of data binding.